I do not.
Okay.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
Not bad.
All right.
Sean didn't bring him in paper version with.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm going to call the meeting to order. First thing I'm going to do is a roll call of the members. And I think, Alan, for your purposes, the only three that are not in attendance, do it that way, it'll be easier. Yes, this is supposed to be on. Can you hear it now? Any better? All right, I'll put it over here. The only three members that are not in attendance are Joe Coughlin, who's under the weather, Rich Grassi, who's traveling, and John Chapman, who has another meeting that came up at the last minute. So those are the only three that I see are not in attendance. So we do have a quorum, and we can continue with the business. Pine just mentioned that many of the members apparently did not receive a copy of the draft minutes. Show of hands, who remembers seeing it, that got it, the minutes? And who didn't get the minutes? Huh.
I followed up and
He asked for it.
Who'd you send it to, Rob, me?
Yeah,
I sent out another copy a second time around.
yeah, and I got it, I got that.
Oh, you did get that?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
the one, I printed it out, that's the one. Pine has
Okay.
right now.
Okay, sorry, Sean.
No, that's okay. I just want to make sure that we're not having an email problem. Everybody else got it all right? Okay.
Get it.
Alan,
Around that way.
because I'd love to blame Alan. You didn't get it?
They're orange, Kevin.
What we're gonna do. One of these copies. Bear with me 1 second. If you could just, on your agenda or one of the others, just give me the email address directly for you. Mr. Gorski probably got it.
yeah.
Okay, so a couple of quick housekeeping items, once we get through the minutes. Are there any changes or edits or corrections to the minutes for those of you who had a chance to read them? Is there a motion to accept the minutes as presented? Is there a second? All in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed? Hearing none, the minutes are accepted. A couple of things, housekeeping, once again, the great folks from PACTV have asked me to remind you of a couple of things. One is that the microphones are live the entire time. So if you are going to speak, remember that they're live and everybody can hear you. If you'd prefer your conversation to be quiet and private, you should probably wait till 8:30. So that's, the second is, Dave has given me the replay list if you're interested in letting anybody know when these will be on Comcast and all of the others. In Duxbury, they play at 7 p.m. on Channel 39 and Verizon and Comcast. Pembroke is also, I think, the same time. 7:30 a.m. on Friday. We're apparently getting top billing on a lot of these. Here we go again, eh? 7:30, and Dave can come out and tell us whether it's AM. And then it's available online from YouTube, user, PACTV video, and PACTV.org. It's a video on demand. And if you need this, I'll be glad to share this very detailed note with you later on. The next meeting will be here at PCIS on Wednesday, February 21st, 2018 at 6:30 p.m. The agenda for that will be prepared and distributed, obviously, but the three major points that I think I want to mention tonight, in addition to if you've got any suggestions of additional things you'd like on the agenda, one is we'll be receiving a report from Entergy on the decommissioning fund. Joe will be providing that report. The second will be receiving a report from Entergy on the recent storm and the flooding that was sort of record-setting around eastern Massachusetts. And then the third major piece that I suggest we really focus on is a detailed update from each of the working groups for where we are at that point. So that'll be February. And again, I welcome any of your ideas, input. If there's any discussion points on that now, we can talk about it, or if you want to just send it to Kurt and I individually, we can do that. All right? Hearing none. The March meeting is going to be a very good one, I think. As we had promised, we're going to try to move it around a little bit. So the March meeting will be held at the Tilden Arts Center and Theater on the campus of Cape Cod Community College in West Barnstable. The meeting, and you have a copy there of the invitation that's been sent at this point to all federal and state officials, but it'll also be going out to local officials, inviting them to please attend and participate in the upcoming meeting on the Cape on March 21st. I think it's the 21st, but I'll get you the exact date. We really do need their input as we prepare our first report to the governor and to the legislature. There's a lot of legislative activity, many of you are aware of it, so that I think it'll be a very, very good opportunity for us to hear what representatives of our federal, state, and local delegations. At this point, as you saw in the letter, we're encouraging at least 5 minutes and try to maintain some sort of organized process so that everybody gets a chance. If they need more time, we'll obviously give them more time. Any questions or comments about the Cape Cod meeting?
Mr. Chair, do you have a list of who it was sent to, and is there any need for any follow-up with any of us that have relationships with some of these folks?
That is a great question, David, and I will answer it. It was sent to both of our U.S. senators. It was sent to Representative Keating. It was sent to all of the state senators in and around the EPZ, or the EZP, so that it includes everybody as far west as Senator Pacheco, and of course the senator from the Cape and the Islands, Senator Sear, and Senator DiMacedo, and to the north. It was sent to the state representatives in that same area. We didn't extend beyond that. And I've just finished building the list personally for all of the boards of selectmen, so that it'll be sent to all of them as well. But to David's point, I encourage all of us to mention it to our friends and elected officials, to encourage them to come and participate in it. I think it's essential that we get them to tell us what they're thinking, and we can share with them what we're thinking at this point. Any other comments on it?
We're gonna,
Yeah.
so I understand, did you include both the Senate, yeah, I think, or yes, but reps, all of Barnstable County?
Yeah, all the state reps for Barnstable, Plymouth, and some of Bristol County.
Okay, and for selectmen, is it just the,
It's Cape Islands,
EPZ?
it's the same basic
Same,
geographic.
okay.
And that was quite a chore to get that list done. Somebody had it, that would have been good. Any other, yes, Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering, has there been a discussion, and I apologize, I
No.
was out of town for the last two meetings,
You were well represented.
probably better than I am tonight. I'm wondering if there's been discussion about whether the commission is going to take any kind of position relative to the pending legislation, or whether that would be even appropriate.
I'm not aware of any discussion about that to this point.
I mean, I'm kind of curious as to whether there's any interest in doing that in the room here.
I think that would be a great topic for the next meeting, so that everyone would have a chance to have read to have a chance to discuss it, or at least dig into it a little bit to read it. But if people would like to chat about it tonight, we certainly could do that. We have a few minutes. We're delighted and pleased to have Bill Irwin here, and I don't want to cut into that time, but if anybody would like to make a comment on it, we've got a few minutes now if you'd like to do that. Please do.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do think, and I don't think we should do it or need to do it tonight, but I do think it might be a good idea for us to at least hear what the legislation is about,
Yeah.
and then decide whether we should take a position on it, or at least, I think we should discuss it, since
Yeah.
some of that legislation is pertinent to our own work here.
Absolutely.
So maybe, and I think that the legislature, even though there's a deadline, I think the legislature could be persuaded to take comment from the commission later than the February 7th deadline. So that, that hopefully being the case, I think that maybe we should take that up at a subsequent meeting. I apologize for not bringing this up earlier.
Not a problem. And that's exactly, we have 10 minutes now to go through it. Any additional comments on Senator Wolf's thoughts?
I would personally like to hear from him. I think Senator Wolf had planned on giving us an update, but you couldn't make it, months ago, October or November or something like that. So maybe there's a quick summary he could provide right now that would help us take that action, because I think if maybe the chair or Kurt or vice chairs could send a letter to whichever committee is in charge of that legislation, say, hey, we can't do it right now, but would like to do it by the 21st or whatever.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's going to take more discussion than we can handle tonight. So what I would suggest, Pine, and I appreciate the sentiment, I would be happy to either make a short presentation next time on the legislation, and I think maybe we could ask disposition from the committee chairs to submit late testimony, and I think that would be, I think it would be received.
Any other comments?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I mean,
Yeah.
certainly I defer to the way the Senate works to you, Senator, but we could also ask the committee chairs to extend, right, beyond the Rule 7-day.
Yes.
And that's not uncommon.
Right.
And that might, if we show it's on the agenda and we ask the chairs to extend, then that might be an opportunity for us to be able to weigh in.
Just a quick show of hands then. It sounds to me like we definitely want to put this on the agenda for February. All in favor, just to give me an idea? Okay. Any other comments on that this evening while we have a few minutes? All right. Hearing none, then one of the big,
Can I just- Are you
Oh,
moving
yeah.
on to the next agenda item?
no, I'm still in the administrative things. The working groups, these have been challenging, and I think all of us involved would agree with that, for a variety of reasons. We have 10 minutes, and I was hoping that anyone who would like to share their thoughts on how we might make this better, streamline it well within the laws of the Commonwealth, I'd love to hear it, and I think our fellow panel members would like to hear it. Any thoughts? Pine, you're always good to kick such a thing off.
Well, we were just discussing it beforehand because we've had a couple of meetings on the site, site cleanup and restoration working group, and wanted to have another one. When the last meeting got canceled, we were planning to have it in the afternoon. I think that makes sense for our group because of Jack Priest coming down north, and I think that, you know, Heather would appreciate an advance warning of when the meetings are going to be because of her work schedule. So we were hoping to pair that with the meeting of the formal panel.
Yep.
But to have it earlier in the afternoon, perhaps if we can at the library. But I think making it regular rather than trying to corral us chickens would be much more assurance that we would actually meet. People need warning. I think the warning of the NCAP makes it a lot easier to show up.
Yep. Any other comments? Yes, Heather.
We talked at one of the meetings about maybe having meetings remotely for some people. Is there any, have you heard anything more about that? Because that might make it easier too.
Kurt, do you want to comment?
Heather, I couldn't.
I was just asking if there was any update about meeting members joining the meeting remotely instead of having to drive here, people that are coming from outlying areas or people that have scheduling issues.
Unfortunately, although not impossible, the open meeting law and the Attorney General strongly discourage meetings to be done with remote participation. So you have to make a showing that is more than it simply would be more convenient. And it would still require, I think I'm right in saying you still have to have a quorum physically present. My open meeting law experts out there is nodding their heads. So, I would suggest we not go down that path as much as we all would like to. But Attorney General strongly discourages it.
Any other comments on the working groups at the moment?
Chairman, can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
Is there a way that we are able to use a platform such as Google Documents or something where it can be shared amongst group members where the document can be seen and there is version control?
Yep.
And so if people are unable to participate in person in the actual meeting itself, and there are challenges for participating remotely, that they still are able to offer recommendations and make contributions to the work of this group without actually being there in person.
Well, there are certainly publicly available tools like Google that you could use from a doc control basis. The Google Doc stuff, we use it in our business every day. So you certainly could do that amongst yourselves. I don't know if the state has any tool that they license, is there?
There's no tools that the state can, off the top of my head, that we could allow non-state employees into. I just caution, working on a document within a committee, that's one thing. Using that as a way to deliberate and share information back and forth can violate the open meeting laws. You just have to be careful. It's, if you use a document to start a discussion amongst 6 committee members, somebody puts an edit in and somebody else comments and the next person comments, then you're in fact deliberating and violating the open meeting law. So it can be a tough issue, but there's a way to do it, but you just have to avoid deliberation. And so,
I'd like to make the recommendation that we consider something like that so that members of the working groups are able to work on one document at a time with the version control. And if some member is unable to attend in person, the research and the work that they're doing is still able to be incorporated into the work of the working group, and that the quality of the content and the perspective of the content isn't lost based on someone's inability to be able to travel or participate remotely.
Let's,
I was just going to ask, I don't think there would be any action that's required of us to say that's a great idea. And knowing that, for example, Google Docs is a free tool that's available to anybody that will just sign up for a Google account, the easiest thing may be just within your subcommittee to say, hey, why don't we all use Google Docs? Other people use, there's other tools out there. To me, that's.
serious public records issue here? Let's wait a minute. The question I have, Jessica, to your point is,
I'll think about that.
Kurt, what is the point? You mentioned 6 members. If deliberation occurs among 6 members.
Well, it's a quorum of the body. So if the subcommittee, I was just saying, if the
Yeah.
subcommittee is 6 members, then a quorum of that cannot deliberate, and that includes serial deliberation.
Yeah.
I can't send
After
you an
the fact,
email and
yeah.
you send the next email and we do it serious. So, but there's a way to edit a document and share it without deliberating. I'm just cautioning, if, in the comments, if you start group discussions, that could be a problem. It's a fine line, but.
And Jim, if you want to make a comment on that, we'll do it in the public comment period. Any other comments?
Mr. Chair, I may be out of the loop now, but I know like the Economic Development Committee, we tried to meet once. We only had a couple of us that showed up. We never elected a chair.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure if anything has happened. I don't think there's anybody that's kind of stepped up to say, okay, I'll coordinate the next meeting.
Yeah.
So we just might need to look at how that group's going to come together.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty big problem across the board with one
Okay.
exception.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I saw anything else on the government. I couldn't make the first Government Affairs Committee meeting, but I don't know if they've met
Yeah.
since or what happened there.
Well, one of the things that we got on the February meeting is to really focus on updates from the working groups. So I think the best thing to do might be to have some individual conversations to try to motivate everybody to get together prior to the February meeting. And to the extent that each of the members of each of the groups can do that, if there's anything I can do to help facilitate that, whether it's, getting a hold of the library or whatever, let me know. But I think that's one of the real challenges that we're obviously facing. I like Pine's idea of trying to coordinate it at the same time as a regularly scheduled meeting, but Any other comments or thoughts? Yes, John, how are you?
Good, thanks. Representing the government in the Community Relations Committee, we did not elect a working chairperson yet. We recommended the two people who were absent be considered. But nonetheless, we
Brilliant.
come up with 4 dates where we will be meeting. Actually, we'll be meeting Monday night, January 29th, as our next meeting, and then quarterly from that point. But we have a series of recommendations ready to go, but we as a subcommittee have not approved them, so we're not ready to turn them over to you.
Yep.
But that'll be happening post-January 29th.
That's great.
So, a caution. I hate to be the guy that keeps drumming the open meeting law. But all working group meetings must be publicly posted. And I have not posted, I have not received anything. Today is the 24th. If I receive a notice and agenda tomorrow morning, I will have it posted, and we will, I think, just make, yeah, so I can get it posted in time. So just remember, working groups, I have to receive a notice. You just need to tell me.
For our subcommittee meetings?
Subcommittees are open, yes, are subject, so,
Tonight,
It
John.
also applies to minutes of the meetings. All of this, they have to function just as we function. There is no other way to put it other than onerous. It is onerous, but it has to be done, so you don't always have to be the bad guy, Kurt. It must be done, so.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Kevin.
are we to assume that the meeting room down the hall is still available as it was for previous meetings?
I think generally, Kevin's question, if everybody could hear it, generally the answer is yes, but I have to get a hold of Kathleen Sullivan here.
Okay.
Who's been terrific, but they schedule other stuff, and we're just one of their many customers. So I would advise you, and John, your idea of setting a fixed date quarterly, or if that's what the committee wants to do, the working group rather, just give me the dates and if you want to meet here, I'll coordinate it the best I can.
Yeah, we're planning on meeting in that room,
Yeah.
E03.
Yep. Yes, fine.
Yeah, only to add, we did have one meeting in the staff dining room, so
Yep.
when the
There's another,
classroom
yeah.
wasn't open, it doesn't have the same tools as that room if
Yep.
you're using electronics, but it worked very well.
Any other comments? Yes, Heather.
What about PACTV as a location in the industrial park?
Yeah, I don't think there's any problem with the location as long as we comply with the public notification of it. Whatever works best for the group. Yeah. Any others?
Well, except that we didn't like restaurants, right?
yeah, I did ask the one group not meet in a public restaurant at a table. So,
Yeah.
Just want everybody to have the benefit of that.
I wasn't going to bring it up, but
Thank you, Pine. Any other? Hearing none, we will keep the agenda on schedule. We're honored and delighted, and at first, I'd like to thank Jack Priest personally for letting us know about his counterpart for the state of Vermont. Bill Irwin, at no small inconvenience and cost to himself, has driven down from lovely Vermont to join us this evening. You've got Bill's title and his role up in Vermont, and we're very, very appreciative, Bill, that you could join us, and we look forward to learning a great deal from you this evening. So the floor and the PowerPoint is yours.
Excuse me, could we have the other one on as well?
Just in that one, so we can it go off that one?
Yeah.
The PowerPoint?
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I have to share with you that I went to my director to talk about this just a couple of days ago, and she said, boy, I wish we had had an opportunity to have somebody come down and talk to us having gone through everything that you're about to, I think that I can share some important information, and that's the basis of the presentation, is to share lessons learned. Just a little bit about our role at the Vermont Department of Health. We have conducted environmental surveillance and emergency response activities for Vermont Yankee since before the power plant actually started operating. It was actually part of the entirety of the Yankee plants. Some of you may know that the Yankee Atomic Electric Company was the entity that built the Connecticut Yankee, Maine Yankee, Vermont Yankee, Yankee Row, and Pilgrim stations, that the region thought it was very valuable to have that kind of centralized design and then eventually operation. I'm also a part of organization that Mr. Priest is a part of that dates that same time frame, which is the New England Radiological Health Conference. We have, from all of those states and all of those plants, met annually for the past 48 years to stay on top of what's going on at each of our plants, as well as what's going on in the radiological and nuclear industry as a whole in New England. The health department, in its environmental surveillance, has done a lot to evaluate what the conditions were like before the plant started operations, and then published annually a report of various media, radiological contaminants, if any, in a report that has been published first in paper and is now published electronically every year. And you can go to our website at healthvermont.gov and see that. We also have been very engaged in radiological emergency preparedness, usually serving as the subject matter expertise for training people, for helping develop plans and procedures, and in the exercises that are conducted at the plant over the course of its history. And the health department was represented on a prior organization called the Vermont State Nuclear Advisory Panel, and it was for most of the years of its operation meeting to discuss situations that arose there over its history in Vermont. And when the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel was created after Entergy announced the shutdown of Vermont Yankee, we essentially eliminated what we called VSNAP, the operations-based panel, and went to NDCAP, the decommissioning-oriented panel, and have been meeting ever since first in, I think, December 2013. So this presentation is to share with you a timeline of experiences since then. As you can see, it's about 4 years now that we have been on the course that you will soon be entering if you haven't already taken some of these same steps. Just as a little history, it started with the unexpected announcement from Entergy that they were going to cease operations in August 2013. The plant had just gotten a 20-year license extension, so we were all very surprised by that. But one of the most important things that we did was rapidly put together an interagency government work group to study and help manage the steps of decommissioning. So we had members of every government agency that had a relevant role, not only for the nuclear power plant, but also, as I can see represented here, economic development and community engagement from government as a part of that interagency working group. And this was a separate entity from the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. the interagency working group that we were a part of from Health developed a memorandum of understanding with Entergy over the course of the next few months that was really extremely important to us, and that was needed for the certificate of public good that Entergy sought from our Public Utilities Commission for the approval of the 20-year extension on the license that they had engaged in just prior to the announcement of cessation of operations. And in that MOU, we described a variety of points of interest to all parties, and they were Entergy's various representatives and representatives of Health, the Environmental Conservation Department, and the Attorney General's Office, and the Public Service Department. And that was memorialized in the Certificate of Public Good in March 2014. And probably, from my perspective, the most important ramification of that was the agreement for a site assessment study. This site assessment study, we'll talk a little bit more about it as we go along, is something that I would recommend all parties, citizen advisory panels that are working in decommissioning work towards as well. January 2014, after the shutdown in late December, the plant was permanently defueled. And then what lessons we learned from that is first that pulling these agency representatives together promptly helps us better manage rapidly developing issues. Frankly, Entergy is in the business of generating electricity. And once they stopped generating electricity, it made sense for them to attempt to reduce every cost possible as rapidly, certainly as safely as they could. And because of that, we were kept very busy trying to keep up with a lot of steps that happened very rapidly. And those steps are somewhat predictable, but frankly, if you're not keeping up with what the NRC allows, you're not likely to be able to keep up with it at all. So we actually monitored very closely things that were going on in the docket with the NRC relative to the cessation of operations, and that helped us to stay aware of these very complex challenges. In fact, I've often told people that what we've done since the plant shut down has been probably amongst the most difficult things that we've dealt with in all the 42 years of operation. Equivalent, in some cases, much more difficult. The other thing that we learned very early was that we were going to be, in some degree, pioneers. Every decommissioning that had occurred prior to Vermont Yankee was of a utility-owned company, or a utility-owned plant. And therefore, the utility users, the ratepayers, could be charged for additional purposes and additional costs for those purposes in the rates that were charged in rate cases that could be managed within the state. As a merchant plant, we don't have that capability, as Maine Yankee did, as Yankee Road did, as Connecticut Yankee did. And you here in Plymouth are going to have the same thing with a merchant plant. So we are, as I said, pioneering and blazing a trail for you, and we hope that some of the things that we've learned can help you go along the way. I think another very important lesson is that when you have the opportunity to get an agreement about something very important, especially when you have the, what I'll call, leverage in order to really make it occur, take advantage of that. Don't delay for some later opportunity. We wanted financial support for our environmental surveillance and to have continued split samples from the site of groundwater and other media there. And we thought that we could put this together in a later agreement. But unfortunately, after now almost 3 years of negotiations, we have no new agreement. So we are sad that that did not occur, and would probably have gone back to that original MOU and tried to incorporate it in there. In August 2014, We started to meet with the Entergy technical experts about the preliminary site assessment. This was very valuable. We had tours of the plant. I've been through the plant many, many times. I'm authorized to work there. I'm part of all of their normal in-processing of workers there. So I've had a lot of knowledge about what was going on there, but a lot of the others that are part of the organizations were not as familiar, so it was very helpful. We appreciate what was shared with us by Entergy about the plant and the things that we would need to be kept aware of. And it helped us also to ask for contents of the preliminary site assessment study. And you can see listed there what was in that. First, a spent fuel management plant, which is a very significant issue. We had a head start there. We had an ISFAC already at the time that Vermont Yankee shut down. There were already, I think, 8 casks on the pad at that time. All that was needed was a second ISFAC for the remaining spent fuel casks once those were used. We also were getting a draft post-shutdown decommissioning activities report, one of the very important documents that you'll get an opportunity to look at. But without the site assessment, it's not quite as valuable as we would hope it could be. And in that, probably the best things were the historical site characterizations. This is where they describe where they had had spills, where they had found in environmental surveys some finding of radiological or non-radiological contamination. It was marked on maps, and it gave us some sense of, as I've characterized it sometimes, where the bodies are buried. And that's very useful, not only to us, but it's also very useful to the company as they make their plans, make their site cost estimates. And it certainly, I would assume, was very valuable in negotiations with North Star, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, because it helped them to see what the site was about too. It's, as I was describing to someone recently, it's like buying a used car. You're not likely to do it without getting a Carfax report or taking it to a mechanic and having it gone through. The historical site characterization kind of gives us a good opportunity to see that what we're dealing with better there. And then you can see some other important things, the pollution legal liability policies and a funding strategy, various scenarios that were put together there. Now that was just a couple of months before the PSDAR was published, but it was much more than what is in that PSDAR. What was in the PSDAR very much what I've been told is what the NRC really wants to see. Not a lot of what-if scenarios where we could do it this way, we could do it that way, we could do it this way. One way that you're going to do it, and so the choice was it's going to be safe store for 50 years, followed by 10 years of decon, which is dismantling and decontamination, and then license termination in 2072. And the cost estimate was $1.25 billion. So lessons from that, after having seen a lot of PSDARs, reading them to be prepared for our interagency meetings, what I saw from the Entergy PSDAR did not deviate much from that, except the site-specific cost estimate, which of course has to be different. But that's a very difficult document to read because it's got a lot of milestones that may not make a lot of sense to a lot of people. So again, it's helpful to have engineers and other experts who can help understand some of those line items to be better prepared for what those costs are related to and then how that all pulls together in that PSDAR. The site characterization that we got in the site assessment study is only required by the NRC at the latest stages of the decommissioning. It's just before you start major decommissioning activities, which is dismantling and decontamination. So under the Entergy PSDAR, we would not have seen something like the preliminary site assessment until around 2062. So having that site assessment, seeing that historical characterization was very important to us here in 2014. As 2014 moved along, Entergy moved rapidly to get exemptions to its emergency planning requirements. Obviously, things change when you are no longer operating. I like to tell people it's instead of having a boiling pot of water on the stove with the heat turned up, it's like having just a pot of water sitting there on the stove, and you're hopeful that the pot doesn't rust or doesn't leak. And if it's a complicated pot, that you get it all consolidated into the small volume as you possibly can and have the highest integrity containment around that. With all of those, the emergency planning requirements changing, Vermont Yankee, Vermont Emergency Management, the emergency planning zone towns, all moved to what's called a permanently defueled emergency plan. Very significant change. The EPZ goes to, at Vermont Yankee, the site boundary. So there are no off-site response organization requirements at all. FEMA goes away. All of the FEMA funding goes away as a requirement. All the NRC requirements for funding off-site response organizations goes away. So it was a significant step to have occurred in 2015. That was then overshadowed by news reports in February of 2016 about groundwater leakage into the turbine building basement. And you can see some of the devices that were used to capture that water. I think it surprised a lot of people, the volume of water that entered in. When the plant stops using its sumps and all of its systems to recirculate water there, to process that water, reuse that water, and when all of the systems that generate a lot of heat themselves are turned off, so there's no evaporation of moisture that's there, nature takes its course, the material, the water seeps in through the concrete, it finds its way, as we all know water is apt to do. And it started filling the basement, and Entergy took steps that were quite dramatic in the press, but realistically speaking, appropriate to contain that water. Entergy has always had, since the mid-'80s, I believe, maybe '90s, a policy of not discharging contaminated water into the environment. And so we were appreciative that they actually captured this water and then shipped it off for disposal at a licensed disposal facility. But we did ask to make sure that we were aware of what was going on with this groundwater leakage for, at first, weekly reports and then monthly reports. And we did have and continue to have very good reports from Entergy about that. At probably its highest point, there were 2 5,000-gallon tankers of water being shipped off-site that was lightly contaminated with tritium from groundwater leakage into the turbine building. And that continues today, though the volume is much less. While all of the water was being collected, a variety of efforts were also undertaken to try to stop the groundwater intrusion, and those efforts have been partially successful, but not entirely. So it continues to be an issue to collect this groundwater to dispose of it as low-level radioactive waste. We also have been very busy in the legal side. As a pioneer blazing this trail, we've attempted to argue for states' rights vehemently. In particular, we have joined in the advance notice of proposed rulemaking on decommissioning, believing that it was extremely important for the states to have a voice, to have a strong role in decommissioning, because in the end, it's land that was once a part of the state that will be returned to the state as private property in some fashion, and certainly as it has impacts on the rest of the environment there, as it has impacts on the social and economic aspects of life in the region there. So we also sought that instead of having exemptions from operating regulations, that there would be some sort of specific regulations relative to decommissioning that would help to assure financial and environmental protection, especially because we were aware of significant historical cost overruns at all of the other plants that have gone through decommissioning. So again, the lessons that we've learned from this, that we need to be prepared for the cessation of funds for emergency response. They will go away as the EPZ is reduced in size outside of that EPZ. And that is something that a lot of states and the nation as a whole are not prepared for, I believe. We also did not, any of us probably, have a really good feel for how much groundwater intrusion would occur. And I can imagine with a plant on the canal here in Plymouth that you would have significant concerns about that after shutdown as well. And having a good assessment of what the geological site conditions are is very helpful to having a better understanding about how it might go once the plant is shut down. And it's really important to work hard to not just try to convince the licensee to do the right things, but also the NRC to do the right things. We frequently testify before the NRC, either in person or in briefs, and we hope that it has not only benefited us, but that we hope that it helps other states as this moves on. As I mentioned, over the past couple of years since the announced shutdown, we've tried to negotiate a variety of things. One of those are what we call site restoration standards. And these are standards that are designed to say what it will look like when it's done, and how it would be financed, and what kind of standards we would have, for example, in radiation levels or with non-radiological contaminants, and then any kind of financial support that would be valuable in arriving at what all parties desired. We also had a lot of testimony over this course of time. As I mentioned before, and this was in the federal courts and before the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board. And what I think is perhaps one of the most important things that we engaged in, we worked with our legislature to have a law passed in May of 2016 that the costs to the agencies of the state to monitor post-closure activities of any nuclear facility in the state could be reimbursed through a bill-back process. And so we're using that as a way to recoup the expenses that we have for doing these things that I've been describing for environmental and emergency preparedness, as well as oversight of the legal and technical aspects of decommissioning. So the lessons: negotiations can stretch on indefinitely. In fact, some of the things that we've hoped for may not be resolved at all with Entergy. That legislative action for bill-back was really important, and not just a backstop, but I think it's going to end up being a real valuable lifesaver for a lot of the things that we do to monitor these decommissioning activities. We are also seeing that this is a new marketplace for business, a huge multi-billion-dollar marketplace where new entities are joining Energy Solutions, other large waste processing and disposal facility company in the country, who's doing the Zion nuclear power plant through Zion Solutions, a private entity, to do the decommissioning there promptly and to make a profit off of that. We are seeing that likely to occur with other plants that are closing in a fairly accelerated fashion across the nation. And we need to be prepared for not only the fast moves of the businesses that are engaged in this, but also the lack of real regulations in this arena. Everything in the regulatory community for nuclear power plants is operating them, not decommissioning them. And it's certainly not related to private entities entering the marketplace to engage in decommissioning. And as I mentioned, the legal issues that we've been involved in and the activities, the amount of time, the number of hours, the number of people involved in it, we would not have predicted it, and I would caution you to overestimate any resource allocations that you might expect. So as we begin to wrap up here, the timeline as it moves into the current time frame since November 2016, of course, we all got another, what I would consider, surprise, and that was that Entergy was going to sell Vermont Yankee to North Star. We did know that there was a suitor out there while we were in negotiations on the site restoration standards and on a second settlement agreement, but we didn't know who it would be. We didn't know when it would come, and it came at a time that frankly did surprise us. But nonetheless, you can see the entities that are a part of that. North Star, with a construction company that is doing the engineering aspects of it, a waste disposal company, Waste Control Specialists of Texas. They own a place to actually dispose of radioactive waste, and Arriva of France for the nuclear reactor engineering aspects of it, especially the dismantlement of the reactor and the reactor and vessel internals. And I'm going to talk about a table in a minute that shows their timeline and cost estimates as compared to the Entergy PSDAR estimates. We're currently in hearings in our Public Utilities Commission. They're running somewhat parallel with hearings at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on the proposed sale and license transfer of Vermont Yankee from Entergy to what will become North Star Vermont Yankee. And then we are hopeful that our goals of a 15 millirem annual public dose limit will be preserved. So far, all of our negotiations have included that, both in those previous settlement agreements and some of the latest information that's available about that. And we are very hopeful that North Star will be a reasonable partner. As I always want to do, it's when I see it in writing and when I see it in action that I'll believe what I hear. And so far I've heard good things. We'll be looking for those things in action and in writing as we move along in the next few months, probably, with some sort of resolution in those hearings. And I apologize if you're not close to this, you're not likely to be able to read it. I am leaving this presentation here on the desktop computer. You can share it with your panel members, as well as we do in our Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel, publish them on the Public Service Department's website for distribution. Actually, Entergy typically also publishes the results of the NDCAP meetings in Vermont, too. But this is probably the most crucial collection of information from North Star's PSDAR. It shows shutdown of the plant as the same. What's really different here is a more accelerated pace of decon, where decon was not going to take place until about 2062 under the Entergy PSDAR. It could start as early as 2019 under the North Star PSDAR. And of course that means then that a 10-year or less period of decontamination, dismantlement, what I often characterize as the biggest industrial effort to ever be undertaken in the state of Vermont, will start. And we'll have to stay on top of everything that happens during that process. It will be very demanding on all of our agencies to try to do that. But the goal, of course, is that that would end much sooner than 2072 and have only an independent spent fuel storage installation as a part of the original footprint of this licensed facility. In the table there, it does describe the ISFSI operations. As is customary, both in Entergy and North Star presentations on the topic, it is assumed that the Department of Energy will begin to take possession of spent fuel from Vermont Yankee at 2052, and it would no longer be on site there. So the North Star figures there on the left side do account for a shorter period of ISFSI storage. Of course, that is dependent on the Department of Energy actually having a place to take spent fuel and put it in interim storage. And I know that there are a variety of options for that, but there is nothing licensed for that currently. So the last slide I have is first, thank you for this opportunity to present here. I hope that I, not only through this presentation, but in answering some of your questions, I can help you, because I think that it is extremely important that states be very active in the decommissioning of these facilities, because the better that you do it, the better the long-term consequences for those generations that follow us. And I leave you my email address. You're welcome to write me, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can with any answers to your questions. And I can do that at the pleasure of the panel chairs.
Well, Bill, thank you very much. There'll be an appropriate thanks at the end, but we had allocated quite a bit of time for the panel members to ask questions. So I'd like to first just open it up. Anybody, please?
Yes.
Paul, go ahead.
Yeah. Dr. Irwin, thank you very much. Very professional, very informative. I've studied some of your past work, and I've looked at other decommissionings, for instance, Yankee Row here in Massachusetts. It seems to me one of the big contentions, the differences are between the federal guidelines at the 25 millirem per year allowable, using the farmer and living on the land, and as opposed to the states. It seems like all the states have chosen skirting, sometimes just below it, but like at Yankee, it was something not as you're looking at 15, and still not 25 either. What is the source? What is the difference between, is this a means of measurement, or is this lessening of standards?
Yes. It's really based on our regulations. Our current regulations are that the public dose limits for operations of the plant or activities that occur at the plant are 5 millirem from 5 different pathways. So 5 millirem from radioactive iodine, which is only produced when the plant's operating, radioactive noble gases, which again are only produced when the plant is operating, and then 5 millirem from liquid effluents, 5 millirem from air, from the particulates that might be in the air, and then finally 5 from direct gamma radiation from components that exist there, and then that radiation just passes through time and space to affect members of the public. So in essence, we are expecting compliance to our regulations that the dose to the members of the public would not be more than 5 millirem from 3 pathways, from liquid effluents, from air, particulates, and from direct gamma radiation from components buried on site there or otherwise left there on site. So that's why we say 15. Some entities have chosen to argue, for example, 10 millirem from all pathways except water, and 4 millirem as related to the EPA guidance on liquid effluents. We think that ours is reasonably close to that kind of approximation, but that's the basis of our dose limits.
If I may, I guess my point that I was having trouble understanding was, why is there a difference between the federal limit and the state limit?
You know, when I'm asked this, I want to make sure people understand that both 25, 15, and 10, these are all very protective of public health. It's extremely important that people understand that. But we also have in our science the goal of reducing all radiation exposures as much as we possibly can. We call it as low as reasonably achievable, keeping in mind the costs of doing so. You can't ask them to spend billions to save all of the millirem to zero. But that is why states generally are choosing to have lower values, is because we want them to work harder to leave the place cleaner than they would otherwise. And we think that, again, 25 is protective of public health, but 15 is even more protective of public health.
Well, I do believe I've stated previously that the Department of Public Health is in discussions with Entergy, but with the expectation that Entergy would meet the current 10 millirem in a year limit for residual contamination or residual radioactive material for an unrestricted release of that area.
You did say that before, and I was trying to understand the biological effects of the difference, perhaps just my personal opinion, but based on the federal guidelines, it didn't seem like they real, I've yet to see a technical justification for the difference, which inevitably results in one could spend the whole decommissioning fund on just that. And then the town of Plymouth does without. You don't get the restoration. And so that was what I was trying to explore.
We've shown, and you can see from the other states that have implemented those lower numbers than the NRC limit, that it was not a significant change in financial burden to meet that. That if they're decommissioning that area and they're removing that soil, by the time that they do it, along with decay, most, and I think Bill can verify that, these other utilities are well below those limits.
Any other questions? Kurt?
I'm just curious, you many times said we negotiated, we testified, we submitted comments, we monitored. I'm curious who the we is, and to drill down on that, many times it struck me as the we might be state agencies working under their authority, but I wasn't sure how often you were talking about your decommissioning panel, and if it's the decommissioning panel, was your panel staffed? We're not right now. So I'm just trying to get a sense of who was doing all of this work and how much of that was the panel versus state agencies acting under their authorities.
Yeah, so almost everything that I described here was the agencies in particular. And yet, as a member of the panel, I would report to the panel what state agencies, at least what we were doing for the Department of Health. At our NDCAP meetings in Vermont, I've probably made 4 or 5 presentations over the past 4 years about different areas of interest for us, as well as the status of certain things. Other departments have done the same. So our key departments engaged are the Department of Environmental Conservation, the Public Service Department, which is for, you can imagine, utilities and energy, and the Attorney General's Office, although they're actually not a part of the panel. The DEC and Health and Public Service are part of the panel. Other members of the panel that would have some knowledge of what was going on would be those members of the panel who were parties to hearings at the Public Utilities Commission. So the panel was typically not engaged in most of these activities, but was trying to stay aware, and where possible, they would create position statements to share with the Public Utilities Commission on certain issues based on what their knowledge of what was going on was. And the panel was especially beneficial to maintaining awareness for not only themselves, of course, but for members of the public. So for a presentation by myself, or the state nuclear engineer for Public Service Department, by representatives from Entergy or Holtec or Areva, and all of those parties important to decommissioning, that's where the panel really gained a lot of knowledge and tried to make sure that the local communities were getting that same knowledge. But these actions that I presented on here today are mostly state actions.
I just ask one follow-up. Within state government, was there an organized structure, working group that brought these different agencies, probably all within different cabinet structures, together, and a coordinated working group across state government?
Yes. So the Public Service Department, which is responsible for energy and especially the common good of ratepayers in the state of Vermont, was the lead agency and brought the interagency representatives together, again, weeks after the announcement. And then we met monthly or more frequently and continue to do so. And that effort, I believe, is essential because you need all of the capacity that the state agencies have, not just in technical expertise, but legal consultation, legal counsel.
Yeah, to follow up on the director's question, by what authority did they come together? Was it an executive direction, a directive? Was it a legislative requirement? Was it the initiative of the departments to simply come together? What actually was the forcing function there?
So I don't know if there were other initiating actions, but it was certainly Public Service Department that, in my opinion, was most responsible for bringing these parties together.
So initiated by the Secretary of...
Yeah, the Department of Public Service Commissioner, who reports directly to the governor.
As a follow-up question, I mean, so much of what we have come to believe over the number of years, certainly during the operating of the plant, sort of neuters the state relative to preemption. And I'm wondering how often that coming together of state agencies has either run into preemption issues, and if so, successfully addressed it in a way that gives you more than simply having input, but actually gives you some authority over the process.
Yeah, preemption is always something that we're keen to be aware of, and yet we've always had our own regulations for public health relative to Vermont Yankee. And during the most recent revision of those regulations, Entergy was the primary public comment giver, and we were able to still have our regulations go through. And they are, to their credit, have always abided by our regulations and have stated so in all of the proceedings that have occurred across the time that I've been there. And yet, we have been very careful to recognize that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has the legal authority for health and safety relative to the licensed activities there. So we are certainly walking a thin line between federal preemption and what we believe are states' rights. And frankly, I believe it's in the common good sought by all parties, including the licensee, in this case Entergy, to continue to allow the state to have this position that we've been able to do so. And I believe that that's because they recognize it's the right thing to do.
David?
Great presentation. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts here. So I'm curious, with the memorandum of understanding, how that process in the beginning unfolded. What did you use to get Entergy to the table to kind of get them to agree? I mean, I think it's a wonderful idea to have some of this activity outlined ahead of time. And then was there any teeth associated with the memorandum of understanding, or could you talk a little bit more about how the process unfolded?
Yes, it's very important in everything we do in life to have leverage, and we did have leverage, and that is in the form of a certificate of public good, which was required for Entergy to continue operating beyond its original 40-year license. And so we had that memorandum of understanding be one of the conditions for the certificate of public good to operate beyond that 40-year license. So it was in the license extension, the 20-year license extension proceedings, that was where we were able to have the MOU incorporated as one of the conditions of the certificate of public good. And so that's why we were able to obtain it. We are in similar place today, where we have a certificate of public good for the license transfer and sale to North Star. And so we hope to incorporate some of our jointly, Entergy, North Star, the state of Vermont, and other parties. We hope to incorporate conditions in that certificate of public good that are for each party's benefit. And of course, that's a part of negotiations that take place in those processes, some compromise, obviously, but that is a process that we've used throughout the life of Vermont Yankee, and it has helped us immensely throughout various transitions that have occurred.
That's great. And like just one observation, you know, as we think about moving this process forward, I think the we question was great about who's doing the work. And given that this panel really isn't authorized to interact that way, it's more of a communication tool, having a good understanding of what the different state agencies are going to be doing through this decommissioning process, and then where some of the gaps are, I think is going to be really informative for us to be able to give recommendations about, you know, other steps that the state may need to take, or that we think would be helpful for the state to take, that aren't identified based on the way the state's thinking of approaching this now.
Jessica?
Just a question on, I don't mean for it to be an unfair question, but what is your sense of where you would be today if you did not have the certificate of public good to be able to use as leverage for negotiations?
You're right, it is unfair.
Sorry. Our situations happen to be different, so I'm trying
Yes.
to take what you've shared with us and be able to apply it in a meaningful way, given the situation that we have here.
Yeah. Well, I am speaking only for myself, really. I believe that this represents one of the great strengths of the United States and our individual states, is the public process. And that public process can be used as a means by which public opinion can help sway those who might not otherwise take a position to do so, because they recognize it is in the majority of the public's interest. And yet, there's no guarantee of that. You could have good actors and bad actors, and the good actors will recognize that public interest. The bad actors will act in complete denial of that. We obviously worked within a process that provided us leverage, but I tend to believe that a lot of what we've been able to do with the licensee in Vermont is because they wanted to do the right thing. For example, I gave the history of our most recent revision of our regulations. They could have they could have taken the preemption of the NRC and said, you cannot make any regulations that we're going to abide by, but they did. Not object to the final positions that we had for regulation. We've had other controversies over the course of time, and we have generally worked together to do the right thing. And I would hope that Entergy or any other licensee for a nuclear facility in the United States would try to do the right thing in their communities. Because in the end, they live in this country too, and are usually going to have a variety of interests that will weigh on them wherever they are.
Just a second question, if you don't mind. Given the work that you have done in Vermont, I'm curious to understand what your recommendations might be for the collective working together, and what what could be used, what vehicles could be used to be able to have that collective voice, and where you think sort of the shorter term opportunities are, and then maybe mid to long term, and what you'd recommend for us to look for.
Yeah. Entergy and the whole community, having gone to school in Massachusetts and worked in Massachusetts for decades before moving to Vermont, I can tell you there's a wealth of expertise in the state that you could call on to come here to educate this panel. That's the best thing that you can do. Educate the panel and educate the community about the issues so that you're working with the facts and able to see where something seems right and where something seems wrong, and where something seems right to reward that, and where it seems wrong to take action to try to prevent that from occurring. And typically the legislature is where people actually get work done that has a very solid foundation for protecting the rights of its citizens.
Any other questions? Yes, Kevin?
Thanks again for coming down and a great presentation. I'd like to go back to the we question. I know you said the Public Service Department took the lead. Could you maybe give us a rundown of who the other players and the state agencies were? I think that might be informative for us.
Glad to. First, the population of all of Vermont is 630,000 people, so just keep that in mind. We all know each other, or we know somebody who knows you. So we work together a lot, and we also have a need to do a lot as individuals. So we have had a lot of people devote a lot of time and not, in most cases, not actually be compensated for it. But they come from the Public Service Department, where not only are there the full-time staff, but legal counsel that supports them behind the scenes, and then some consultants. Those consultants, you could talk to the Public Service Department, and they'd be glad to share with you what kind of expertise that they brought in. You know, they have a tendency to hire the most experienced and knowledgeable people to help them, as well as the legal counsel that they bring in, both in-house legal counsel and external legal counsel. We also have our Agency of Natural Resources, in particular the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is, as you can imagine, usually engaged in site remediation issues, so they do cleanup all the time. And so they're focusing on the non-radiological issues on site there. And there are some, not as pervasive in some cases as the radiological ones, but they can be significant. And they're also very good with a lot of processes. And some of those processes of site remediation have some additional leverage that can be brought to bear that is useful. For example, the fact that they do these remediations a lot, they know what ought to be incorporated into a good one. We also have our Agency for Community Economic Development. Because it was a 650-person employer and is now less than 100 people employed there, it's had a tremendous economic impact on that region, which is not just Vermont, but also Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And they have also brought in the Wyndham Regional Commission. Vermont doesn't have county government. In its place, we have regional planning commissions. And the Wyndham Regional Planning Commission, and not only part of the panel, Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel, but also a party to the hearings before the Public Utilities Commission. And they were usually informed of what our interagency commission was doing. The Attorney General's Office, the Secretary of Administration in earliest stages, but after getting going, stepped away from that process, our Emergency Management Agency, course, health, my department. Those are the key players.
Thank you, great presentation. I'm just curious, in terms of the rank order of all of the different agencies, in terms of making recommendations, citing specific types of expectations, Entergy having to respond to both the NRC, which is sort of the overarching entity, coupled with all of the state agencies. When and where were there types of conflicts or third rails that you might suggest to us that as this moves forward in Massachusetts that we be aware of? Are there any particular concerns?
I tried to mention a few of them. One of the most important that I mentioned there is the fast pace that all of these proceedings can take. And I try to be a reasonable person. If I was the owner of a place that once made electricity and now I'm not making it anymore, I'm going to try to reduce all of my costs as soon as I possibly can. And so naturally, that was a cause for Entergy too, but they are very closely watched by the NRC to do it in a safe manner. So that's really a challenge, is to keep up with the pace of the licensee. They will want to move fast because time is money. The other is the NRC as a source of information. The NRC is very good with a public face for information. They provide a lot of documents on their website. They can be difficult to find, but one thing I would recommend is that someone be identified to watch the docket for the Pilgrim license and see and look every day to see what is transacting there, because those are the legal steps of the decommissioning process. That's where the public notice is given. And that can be challenged to keep up with that. Our public service department tried to do that. Our Attorney General's office tried to do that. The other is that it is a very expensive proposition, and when there's that kind of money involved, everyone will fight very hard to minimize those costs, and that means that there will be legal battles that are long and challenging. I think the record in the Public Service, the Public Utilities Commission docket is easily going to have tens of thousands of pages of evidence that people will go through over the course of that. Having the expertise and the time to review all of that is not easily found either. And so it's really important to try to find partners, and if you can, to hire consultants and others to help with that process. Those are the key ones, I would say.
Any other questions? Hi, did you have a question?
No, I thought Senator Wolf had a question over there.
I hardly know where to start. I mean, I'm not sure whether we intentionally don't want to deal with the issue of the authority relative to enforcing recommendations because we actually don't want to kick that issue. Because if we do, we may get answers we don't want, like we really don't have authority. I'm also, I mean, I say this to the group here. As I'm hearing this discussion and the resources needed to actually do a good job from the state perspective, and even the legislation that's filed, which is asking to give us the capacity to have funds, but no mechanism to actually get them from the state. I mean, it allows us to ask for grants or to ask for people to give donations. Honestly, I mean, this is what it's come to. Potentially the most important public safety issue in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the best we can do is get a piece of legislation that allows us to beg for money from nonprofits and individuals. That's where we are. And I guess if I had to phrase that into a question, just to be polite, because I don't want to put you through the torture of sitting here and listening to us rant and rave. I mean, am I hearing you suggest that we actually really need material resources in order to do a good job with this?
So our panel is not taking the same kind of role that the interagency group did. The interagency group are staff from agencies that have responsibilities that are directly related to the decommissioning of a nuclear facility, either because it has non-radiological contaminants, radiological contaminants, or significant impact on the environment or the economy. And so it was considered to be a part of our jobs to engage and to work together. It's like a lot of other things. I could not have done everything that our interagency group did together alone. But it was with them that we were able to, as a team, get a lot of these things done. And we carried that even further to bring in other states. New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts were a part of our filing on the advance notice for proposed rulemaking. But that's one of our other modus of operandi, is to work as a team where we don't have the resources individually, but to take advantage of the expertise that exists there and to find the time to engage. And we did.
So can I just,
Let's do this. One follow-up question.
Just as,
Senator
thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a follow-up, I guess, no, I don't want to put words in your mouth, even though I'm about to try. So I guess the question is, if you're here to inform and possibly advise, I think what I'm hearing is that you're advising us to ask state agencies to find the capacity to engage on this issue. Because up until now, and again, I'm a former state senator, but I mean, we talked to agencies, and the answer we got pretty much was, we don't have the capacity, nor do we have the mandate. And I guess what I'm hearing is, maybe we need to ask again.
So it's important also to recognize what I described as our bill-back capacity. The Public Service Department has always had the bill-back authority. The Agency of Natural Resources, where our Department of Environmental Conservation has always had bill-back authority related to the dockets for Vermont Yankee before the Public Utilities Commission. And Health recently got that 2 years ago. And so that is a means by which we can provide the resources. People are paid to work those hours. So that's another important aspect. If people are not funded to provide that time, then certainly you can understand that they're funded to do other work instead. And so that is an important part of our, and the funding from Entergy.
so I just want to sort of, it's been very valuable, and I focused in on the role of state agencies and coordination for a couple of reasons, and to respond directly to Senator, what you're concerned about. When I was tasked with, by the governor's office, with co-chairing the panel, I was explicitly tasked with trying to figure this piece out, which is the cross-secretariat, cross-agency piece, and with coming back to one of the governor's primary advisors to discuss this issue. And so for my fellow state representatives here, and there's a few of us here representing DPU, DEP, Public Health, Emergency Management. I don't think I'm missing anybody. But, I mean, the key, as you talk within your shops, I will tomorrow initiate this conversation, and who I work directly with will be governor's, his policy advisor in this area, and with the Chief of Staff in the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, I'm sorry, Energy and Environmental Affairs, who've been really and I will take it upon myself, hold me to it, please, to report back in a month as to how the state may look to work and coordinate across secretariats, across agencies, and including, Attorney General's office. Because clearly what we need is to build that structure that mirrors what you did there. And my last statement is, for those, you may be one senator, there's certainly others in the audience who may have for many years asked the state to weigh in on issues pertaining to the operation of the plant and not felt like they got a lot of traction. I think that talking about the state weighing in on the process of decommissioning is a whole different discussion. And I sense a willingness in the governor's office to approach this in a robust way.
Walter, do you have one?
Yes, and it was just a further exploration of what Senator Wolf and Mr. Schwartz were talking about. It was for Dr. Irwin. It is not like this is the first time in New England that we've done this. We have decommissioned similar-sized plants in Connecticut, Maine, even in our own great Commonwealth, okay? The authority of the federal government and the authority of the state and its various departments has not changed. Deregulation might have taken some of the resources to pay for things out of it, but our standards have not changed, okay? So with an eye towards deregulation and how it changed the balance, I don't think that with $1 billion in our decommissioning fund, okay, which is to give Plymouth back, okay, its parcel of land just as it had before, that is beyond the realm of reason. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. First, I want to thank Dr. Irwin for an excellent presentation. I think he represented very well the lessons learned, and there's absolutely nothing in his presentation I would not agree with. But Mr. Smith kind of took the words right out of my mouth. This is the second decommissioning in Massachusetts, and so there is a roadmap, and the decommissioning of Yankee Row is a very successful effort because of the collaboration between the agencies and the owner of that site through the DEP, Department of Public Health, and all the agencies. So I would also caution us to kind of look back to see what worked well and what didn't work well, and there's people that are still working in the state right now who can speak about that, and also respect what was done in Vermont. So we're not starting from ground zero, so, take advantage of the lessons learned that we have right here in this state.
I think we're in a unique part of the state where, yes, we did decommission a much smaller plant, Yankee Row, in that part of the state, and the economic model for that is much different than what we're dealing with decommissioning the Pilgrim plant along the bay with that potential impact that could be. And, they opted to decommission Yankee Row right away, and that may not be the case for Pilgrim. So trying to resolve these issues and get some uniformity from the state agencies, and to have maybe a lead state agency to look to the legislature to assist us with how do we fund expertise. If you went to any one of our state agencies right now and said, okay, I need you to give up 5 guys to work on this project full-time, it's going to be, okay, what am I not going to do so I can take on that additional load? So the purpose of this panel is to make recommendations to the governor on what we think we will need to be successful to decommission the plant. And those are the line items that we need to put together to make those good recommendations to the governor.
Jack, that's a perfect segue. We've got about 10 minutes left before we provide the public with an opportunity. And I wanted to take a few minutes to ask you some very specific questions. First, let me just make a comment. The timing of this could not be better, Doctor, for what we're trying to do in our series of meetings that's coming up, including the one with elected officials. My personal opinion, I'm still only speaking as one member of the panel, is that the proposed legislation you heard mentioned earlier doesn't go nearly far enough. It's a beginning. It's not even where I think our recommendations will come. Your outline of lessons learned is a nice, very valuable framework for us because we're dealing with those similar issues plus more. But I'd like to get down to a little level of granularity because at some point, as you heard mentioned about kicking the can down the road here, we're going to have to make a recommendation to the governor and the legislature. Hopefully we do it as a collective group, so we're all in agreement on it. But things like, for example, legal counsel. It's part of the process. How many attorneys would you say have been involved just in Vermont's situation?
It's hard for me to know
Yeah.
because I'm not a part of every different process, but just about every agency has one or two that is working on Entergy and Vermont Yankee decommissioning issues. Usually one is a lead and may devote most of his or her time to it, especially since we are very active, not just because we're actually in the stages of decommissioning, but also because we are in a variety of judicial settings. So I would say there's dozens of attorneys easily.
And from a technical expertise, because there's a wide range of topics here that are going to have to be addressed, and while we're sure that Entergy will act in the same good faith that they're acting with you in Vermont, we need our own experts. Just, again, a ballpark range of how many different types of technical experts has Maine gathered to help with this process.
Again, you know, the figure I used for attorneys and dozens, it's not that they're all fully engaged all the time, but they can be called on for different tasks. The same with technical experts. I think that there's probably a dozen or so technical experts that have weighed in on different aspects of this. It's a very wide-ranging collection of activities to decommission a federally licensed nuclear power station. You can imagine all of the ramifications in just what I said in that sentence. And for that reason, you need people with expertise in how reactors work, how deconstruction works, in the radiological issues, the non-radiological issues, waste disposal issues. Costs are huge because you need to verify that the estimates seem appropriate and that the party that's engaged has the capacity to meet those costs and not leave the state with cleanup because they couldn't meet those needs. So economists are also very important to the process.
Let me ask you on the MOU, what are the types of things that are included in it?
So it's a public record, and I would
Yeah.
prefer that you go to the MOU itself. I have a copy of it
I
on
have
my
a copy of
computer.
that I
Yeah.
can share.
That would be great. If you don't mind, Jack, sharing it with everybody. Then let me ask you, on the build-back process, where are those funds coming from?
Yeah, so wherever Entergy finds it appropriate to obtain those, in the past, it's been through their operating revenues. Now that they're no longer operating, they would find it in another source, and I think that a part of their consideration would be the Decommissioning Trust Fund.
Has that been used to this point?
So I'm not aware of that exactly. I think it might be a question better answered by Entergy as to where any of the bill back that they have paid subsequent to shutdown, any bill back that they have paid, what was the source of those funds? I
And
can't explain that myself.
is there a public location where we could find how much has been billed back at this point and paid? Because that would give us a fairly good estimate
Right.
of what the financial resources to do a comparable project load.
Yeah, I'm fairly certain it's not published, but I know the figures exist. And again, probably your best source of information is Entergy.
Okay. And do you have a sense, just a guesstimate that you could give us?
No, because we are transitioning from the operational phase where we had bill back and a new phase of decommissioning with bill back, I'm not fully aware of all of the different bill back that has occurred. I can only speak for what we've billed back from health. And so again, I would suggest that Entergy would be the best source to come up with a summary of that.
They've been very helpful, great so far, so I'm sure they'll be cooperative on this topic. Any other questions? Yeah.
Claire?
Just an observation and
Yeah.
a comment. Through the Government Relations Committee, we've had one working group meeting, and pretty much everything that's been discussed this evening is what we actually put into our report in terms of actually asking for specific amounts of funding. We had put in $50,000, which after tonight's discussion is woefully inadequate, to say the least. I mean, it should be probably $5 million. And also, we're going to recommend that cabinet secretaries collectively come together, create a lead agency, because we, as an advisory panel, I mean, we don't really have the authority to rule and regulate. Our mandate really is to come up with a report. And that report supposedly is due this coming fall.
June.
June. I think we are woefully inadequately prepared to make that report so that, A, it reflects, if you will, all of the issues and concerns that we as a advisory panel supposedly need to address. So I think we almost have an emergency kind of situation on our hands where we collectively need to make sure that specific recommendations need to be made in the immediate so that all of these areas can be addressed. And ultimately, that report can be respected and have some integrity to it, because as of right now, I don't think we're in a position to suggest that we're even close to that.
Jessica?
Just a clarifying question. The bill back that was made to Entergy, is that the same pot of money or different than the 10 million that was received through, I think it was the Certificate of Public Good? I'm not sure, but I look to my colleagues for clarification on that. Do you know what I'm asking, that the 10 million that was provided as part of the Certificate of Public Good? I'm just wondering if that was the same pot of money or different.
So there are basically two funds that exist. The first is the Decommissioning Trust Fund that was a contribution by ratepayers over the operating history of the plant. That is a substantial amount of money. The other is called the Site Restoration Fund. And that was negotiated in the Memorandum of Understanding in order to provide for what the state thought was appropriate. And that was contributed separately by Entergy into a separate fund, managed totally separately from the trust, decommissioning trust, and the total amount there was 25 million.
So now we're going to move to the,
Ask one
yeah,
follow-up to
very
that.
quick, though, Kev, we want to.
Very, very, this, you may not be able to answer this, but was the Certificate of Public Good the stick that helped prod that 25 million? Because we don't have
Yes.
that.
Yes, it was.
So just to,
Good answer.
the question that I was asking was, did the bill back go from the 25 million that was the site restoration, or did it go, did it
So,
come from the
yeah,
other?
I don't know the source of funds used to pay any bill back. And I would only be guessing.
Joe, did you want to make any comment?
I just wanted to clarify a couple things. As part of the MOU, there was $25 million that was paid for the Site Restoration Trust. That was funded by Entergy, not out of the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust. There was $10 million in economic development money to Wyndham County. That was also not paid out of the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust. And there was slightly over $5 million in kind of energy resource money for the area as well. So there was a number of payments in the MOU that were all paid prior to shutdown or over a phased-in period of time. The 25 million was 5 per year, the 10 million, 2 per year. So, and none of them had to do with Bill back.
Okay.
Thank
you.
I think
Thanks
that's
for
what you learned
clarifying.
from
That's
some of
what
the
I
other
was
meetings.
wondering.
Yep.
Yep,
Thank you.
Joseph. We're going to do the public comment and questions now, if you don't mind, Dr. Irwin.
Absolutely.
Two things. One is identify yourself, as always, identify yourself. And two is keep it germane. We're honored and very fortunate to have Dr. Irwin here, so let's keep it to the topics at hand. So, in our usual format, how many people would like to ask a question? I see only 3 hands tonight. That means you each get 5 minutes. Let's start with Mary this evening.
Does Dr. Irwin want to stay for the questions, or
Yeah,
should we?
he had
Yeah.
said he would. Do you
Okay,
mind?
great.
Well, I'm glad to. I thought I would give the mic.
Yeah, you're very kind.
Thank you. I just wanted to-
Mary Lampert from Duxbury. First, number one, request the slides that Bill Irwin to be put on the website so it would be available to all. But it was a wonderful presentation. Second, it seems to my mind that this group can make recommendations not just once a year in a report, but as appropriate as it comes along. So obviously one would be ASAP for an interagency group. Number two is legislation. There is pending legislation now. The drop dead date is February 7th of whether or not the bills are going to go to study, euphemism for rest in peace, or whether they will be reported out. I would be appropriate to consider looking at House Bill 1147, which requires the licensee to pay for emergency planning, radiological emergency planning expenses post-operation until the spent fuel pool is emptied. That is money for MEMA. That is money for every town within the EPZ. The piddly amount for Duxbury of $80,000 a year to up to $200,000 for some other towns. There is a risk until that pool is emptied, and so each town is going to have to figure out, do we pay out of our own budgets so we're doing what we know we should do? Or do we say, the heck with it? That is something I think you'd weigh in on. House Bill 1133 ups the money for monitoring, radiological monitoring for DPH during operations and post-operations from a ridiculous amount now of $180,000 a year, set in 1972, to $500,000 a year. I think that's something that is within our interests. Then we have Senate Bill 2206, something to think about. That would add 3 members to this panel. 1 represented from the AG's office, 1 from the Inspector General's office, and another one from the Barnstable Radiological Emergency Planning. I think it's clear. There have been discussions in this group. Do you have the authority for the state to have a lower standard than the federal government? If you had someone from the AG's office here, that could be discussed rather quickly. Or you could...
You have 1 minute left. And
Exactly.
Got a question for Dr.
As
Irwin.
far as the standard goes, I understand the 15 and have talked that they have in Vermont. I've been working with groups in Vermont who are looking for the 10-4. Contrary to Paul Smith's comments, we asked Bruce Watson of the NRC about how low is reasonably achievable. He wrote back, in the last 7 decommissioned sites, they went from 1 to 3 millirem. I have reviewed and will send you the table that summarizes what Entergy says they release each year by going through their reports.
Thank you, Mary. Get it.
They can do it.
Thank you.
Will you do it?
Rich, let's go with you next so we don't tag team with the Lamberts.
Mary, what was the House bill number for the first bill you cited? The one that,
1147.
the one that would give me more money?
1146.
1146?
Seven.
1147, okay.
Josh Cutler,
Yes.
proponent, and all the representatives from this area are.
Rich?
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Irwin. Thank you for your excellent presentation this evening. It would seem to me that if sufficient decommissioning funds existed for a nuclear facility, that it would be intuitive that the decon option would be a more time and cost-effective way to go than the safe store option. However, the reality too is that by going the safe store option there, it allows for additional decay of certain radionuclides there over a several decade period, as opposed to over a shorter period of time during the decon situation. So I'm curious to hear Dr. Irwin's opinion in terms of the time and cost effectiveness of achieving a tighter health protective standard of 15 millirem, or could be 10 or 5 or wherever it ends up in Massachusetts, versus the NRC's 25 in terms of having a little more radioactivity to deal with at the site if you're going with the decon option.
Thank you, Rich.
It's a very good question about the radiological half-life of some of the materials that are there at the plant. Some of them do have half-lives that would take dozens to hundreds of years to decay to very minimum levels. And that is often cited as one reason to have safe store. But I think a very important proof that you don't need that is in North Star's application to transfer the license to them and to own the facility. They believe that they can accomplish the task without excessively dosing their workers during that time, nor having excessive radioactivity in what is remaining there at the point of the final status survey and license termination. And another piece of evidence relative to being able to proceed promptly into decon is that many nations around the world require that you proceed straight from operations to decon. Often some of the other costs are not radiation to worker costs, but are economic costs to the loss of the land, to other development, to other energy production, things of that nature. So there's a lot of variables that go there that appear to be reasonable, sufficient. So not only this plant, but other plants will likely go to prompt decon.
Thank you. Jim?
Not sure this is what I intended to say when I walked in here tonight, but let me raise the question first of the public records law. That I haven't looked at it now probably for a couple of months, but the last time I looked at it, a number of things came through, all of which indicate that somebody, probably Kurt or one of his people, have a lot of obligations regarding this panel under it. If you read that law, what is a public record is extraordinarily broad. It probably certainly includes everything that is ever handed out to this panel. It includes communications among members of this panel. It includes communications to and from members of this panel. And someone, presumably in Kurt's office, has to be tasked with the job of being the public records custodian, from whom Somebody like me comes in and requests the electronic copies of every single document that should be in that public record. It's an horrendous job, but if the public is going to be able to understand what's going on, it's a job that has to be accomplished, and all these materials have to make it into the public record and be made available. Point number 2, and it was been brought up a couple of times, is both on this preemption and the standard. I think one thing that the panel needs to recognize is the NRC standard is a release standard. It is the standard the NRC says has to be met before it will release the site, typically, and I think it's always done so, for unrestricted use. NRC rules are extraordinarily clear that once that site is released and the license is terminated, the NRC's job is finished. It has no right whatever to control the future use of that site. Entergy specifically recognized this when it filed one of its plans with the NRC at the time when it thought there was a chance it might have to close down if licensing weren't approved. And it said, and I'm going to quote, "The NRC's involvement in the decommissioning process ends at this point." That's release. "Building codes and state environmental regulations dictate the next step in the process, as well as the owner's own future plans and commitments." Where does that lead you? It leads you to the fact that preemption is over the moment that license is terminated. And the state has the right, as, for example, Maine and New Jersey have done, to say, okay, you've got to remediate this site to what is acceptable to the state. And you can't use it for anything until its radiation level is acceptable to the site. With that as a potential for what the state has the clear power to do, one would certainly hope that logic and common sense, to say nothing of economics, would convince Entergy to sit down and reach a reasonable agreement with the state as to what the cleanup status of that site has to be before, frankly, anybody who wants to buy it from them can do anything with it. Yes, the final point there on this release standard, we keep throwing around 25. What we tend to forget is if you read the NRC regulations, and frankly it's in the existing state regulation, it's as low as reasonably achievable with a max of 25. If the NRC is going to do its job, what Mr. Watson has told us makes it pretty clear that what is reasonably achievable is a long, long way below 25. And I would hope, maybe vainly, that the NRC will do its job and make sure that this place is in fact cleaned up to well under 25 and to a level that would be acceptable to the state for future use before the site's released.
You have 1 minute left. Jim, do you want to ask Dr. Irwin a question of any sort?
I guess my basic question is really pretty well covered here, and I think what it comes down to, and Dr. Irwin can correct me if I am in any way wrong, and that is because it had foresight, it seems to me that Vermont set up a structure where it actually would take part and have some control over what happened in that state, and it's gone to extraordinary efforts to exert that authority. I don't know of any equivalent thing that's been done by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Eventually, it seemed to have caved when Boston Edison built the plant in the first place, and it caved again when Boston Edison sold the plant to Entergy.
Are there any other comments, new business from, yes, Senator?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to sound a little bit defensive. The reason we're here is to try to do that, Jim, okay?
Agreed.
And the plant, we still got some time before the plant's shut down. So let's not leave on too negative and pessimistic a note. Hopefully, we'll be there. The other question I have relative to preemption and relative to the state's role is, the NRC, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm not an expert on this, but the NRC approves the post-shutdown decommissioning activities report. And I guess my question would be, once that has been approved, can the state intervene afterwards and insist on things that are not in that report?
Can I add something to that? I'm not sure if that's correct. The NRC doesn't approve that report. They accept
it.
that report.
Yes.
That is correct. It is not approved. It is followed up for a request for additional information but otherwise, if there's no objection, then it is considered acceptable. And whether the state can step in after that is really a unique collection of questions for the
For
specific
which
state.
our 25 lawyers might weigh in.
Before I entertain a motion to adjourn, I personally want to say, Dr. Irwin, terrific performance. Thank you. Very well done. With that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Any seconds?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Have a nice evening. We'll see you in February.